So let's talk about server-side rendering and why it's relevant in 2019. And before I begin, a bit about myself. I think most of you know me. I'm Olavi. I'm working here at Futurice as a software developer, and I'm also one of the organizers of Tech Weeklies. And you can read my blog or follow me on Twitter. I'm ranting of various stuff out there. So let's dive into the topic, server-side rendering. And then I'm, of course, going to talk about client-side rendering as well. So let's try to first understand what server-side rendering means. And I think it's a bit silly term, because it means that your server is rendering the page as HTML and then returning that to the client. But it's then, of course, your client still has to render it on the screen. So why is it called rendering on the server? So it basically means that your server returns a HTML document which has the content already in the HTML document. And then on the opposite side, your server would only return a kind of placeholder HTML document with maybe just one simple div that has an ID app, and then your client-side JavaScript application would hook into that div and then render your content and the whole application there, right? So this is pretty familiar to everybody. Basically, we have gone full circle now. The web it's actually started as fully server-side rendered documents that only contain text and links to another documents on the web, and then you would always render the content on the server, and then images were added to that, and then interactivity like Flash and whatever, all the interactive stuff, and then JavaScript was invented, and JavaScript would allow you to do some interactive content on the client side, jQuery, and then you could fetch the content with AJAX request and manipulate the DOM and stuff like that. How many of you here have been using jQuery to manipulate the DOM? Yeah. How many of you love using jQuery? It was a super useful library when it came, because you didn't have to think about the browser support, for example. And actually the browser didn't have that good APIs at that time. So it was super useful, and it's still used by some projects that I have heard. How we from there then came to React, for example. React was launched somewhere around 2014 or something. And then it allowed you to do more performant DOM manipulations using virtual DOM. So you would be able to create whole your applications just as client-side rendered JavaScript application, and have performant way of updating the visual DOM with virtual DOM and diffing on that. But then, from that, when it was super popular, in our bubble, everyone was using JavaScript-based single-page applications, right? But that's not the whole truth, of course. I think still a big part of web pages are still using PHP and doing fully server-side render stuff. But nowadays, people have started talking again about server-side rendering and the importance of that. And I will try to explain why we do that. And even the AMP project by Google, which is accelerated mobile pages, and its goal is to improve the web performance on mobile devices especially. And they do it by using a Google cache for your web page, and then also restrict the way how you can create your web page. And I don't recommend using AMP, but I'm just going to mention it. And even they came back to this revolutionary technology where you can render your site content on the server. You can use AMP on the server and return HTML to the client. Boom. We have had this for 30 years. Why do you need AMP for that? Okay, so I'm trying to explain why even AMP and why many projects are going back to doing server-side rendering. And as Alex mentioned, it's of course because everyone still secretly loves PHP, right? We would all want to just hack stuff directly on the server, doing direct manipulations on the server with SSH, and then that would be the deployment. Just save the file, and everything would crash on runtime. But yeah, number one reason. So I will go through a couple of reasons. I think 5 different reasons that I think why server-side rendering is still valid and important in 2019. And I would say the number one reason is performance. And why performance is important. I've been talking personally about this, and many others have been talking why performance is important. So I don't think I have to explain that too deeply. But there has been research on how users feel about delay. So a delay of between 0 and 100 milliseconds, it feels instant. There's no interruption in the actions the user is doing. And between 100 and 300 milliseconds, the user will notice the delay but doesn't annoy them. And then between 300 and 1000, so 1 second, they will lose focus and they will notice the delay. And then about 1 second, then there will be a mental context switch. And based on analytics and research, if your page takes more than 10 seconds to load, then the user will most probably leave. They don't even want to wait that long. And there are surprisingly many web pages that take more than 10 seconds to load. Performance is especially important on mobile devices, on various networks and trains, and you can have super slow networks even in Finland. And the mobile and tablet usage has surpassed desktop usage in 2016 globally. Right now I'm not sure what the statistics are for Finland, but this is global statistics. It surpassed in October 2016, and it looks like the desktop usage is going down rapidly. And cheap devices are getting more and more common, especially Android devices. So that's why you have to provide a performant web page to your users so that they don't leave your website. And as Steve Souders put this in 2018 when we were visiting the Performance.now conference, he said that JavaScript is the single biggest problem for web performance today. It's because if you have render blocking JavaScript, or if your content is rendered by JavaScript, then it delays time when the content gets visible on the screen. And there are statistics of that web pages are getting slower, even though you would think that because of the revolutionary new technologies, we would make faster and faster web pages and devices would get faster and faster, but that's not true. The statistics show that web pages are getting slower. And this is statistics from last year when I was doing my master's thesis. So this is about 2018 versus 2017. So even during just one year, the web pages got more than 20% slower. One of the examples on this is by Adi Osmani. He was diving deep into JS processing for CNN.com, and why it's important to reduce the amount of required JS processing on your web page is that even though the site would be fast on an iPhone 8, a high-end device, it would be on an average phone, it would be 9 seconds slower than on an iPhone 8. And then a cheap one, less than $100, it would be 32 seconds slower to process the JS. So imagine having to wait 32 seconds for the content to load. I would just throw the phone out of the window. And one of the most important metrics for how fast your web page is the first meaningful paint. And what it means, you can see an example here. It means the timing between the navigation start. So imagine here on the left, the user clicks a link, or you writes an address to the address bar and hits enter. So the navigation would start here. And then when the browser receives the document from the server, it would start rendering something. So the first paint means that something changed on the page. So visually, so background, something else than the background color. So some background colors to some other elements were rendered, and then first contentful paint means that some content was painted, not just background colors. And then this is the important part, the first meaningful paint, where the most important content is already visible. And usually it's the text and some hero images, so the topmost image on your page. And that's something you want to optimize for. And then, of course, especially in the case of JavaScript application, you want to optimize for time to interactive, because even though if you would manage to render the actual content quickly, but then it would not work, then your users would get frustrated. So for example, if you load a web page and it looks ready, and then you click a menu, for example, and it doesn't open up, then that's super annoying, and it will probably annoy your users as well. And it is possible to make web pages fast. And here is an example of a web page that Futurice have been building. So techweeklies.futurice.com. And this report is from Lighthouse, a super useful tool in auditing your web page performance. And here we can see when you have an well-optimized web page, your first contentful paint and the first meaningful paint will be about the same, because whenever we manage, and it's around 1 second, so that's really good. So we try to render whenever as soon as possible, and we also want to render the meaningful content already by that time. And then time to interactive is 2 seconds. That's pretty good. And that's why Lighthouse gives it a performance score of 100. Then I will show a couple of small examples. These are of super tiny projects, so they are not in a way real world examples, but I will just try to explain what's the biggest difference between if you are doing fully server-side rendered or client-side rendered. So the first example is from a side project that I have been working on, onkometrorikki.fi. So it's a application built with Elm. So Elm is a language that compiles down to JavaScript, and it's pretty well optimized. So it's using 0.19, so it's very well optimized. But as you can see here on the timeline, of course, because it's client-side rendered, the blue thing here is when the network request for the document has ended. So then you can see your main process starts processing the document contents and starts fetching the JavaScript chunks that it needs for rendering the actual content. And only after those JavaScript resources arrive, then we can start doing layout and rendering the page. So you can see the document content loaded, DOM content loaded, first paint, first contentful paint, first meaningful paint happened over there. So quite a lot after the first, the document has arrived. And in this case, it was still quite okay. The site is super simple, but imagine this being a full application. It could take 5 seconds. And then another example this is a silly example as well, because it's from my blog, which is super simple. There's almost nothing. There's one single JavaScript resource that it fetches, and no CSS. All CSS is inlined. But still, as you can see, here's the document. It arrives. The browser manages to render everything immediately. The first meaningful paint happens almost immediately after the browser receives the document. And then it fires the image requests. So in a way, this is not very, very fair comparison, because the first example, it didn't have any assets, like images, but still, you get the point of trying to move the first meaningful paint as much to the left as possible. And your goal should be to render a mobile page, the above the fold content, in less than 1 second, or around 1 second. That's still good. But what that means is 1 second from the navigation start. So if you think about it, on a 3G network with the I don't have the latency here, but anyways, it would take about 200 milliseconds to do the DNS lookup, and then 200 milliseconds for the TCP connection, 200 milliseconds for the HTTP request and response, and then on your server, it might take 200 milliseconds for you to respond. And then it would only lead you 200 milliseconds on the client side and 200 milliseconds on the server to optimize for. So you have to do a really good job if you want to render a page in 1 second on a 3G network. One thing I want to mention here is that you won't be faster than the platform. Don't try to, for example, what we did, we would have a image loading JavaScript kind of library we built ourselves, and we would load the images lazily. You won't be faster than the platform. You would only start loading the images after your JavaScript has arrived, being parsed and executed, and then the browser would be able to fire the image request. But if your images are already in the HTML, your browser can fire the request immediately, and it will probably render a lot faster than if you do it yourself. And a fully server-side rendered page can also have good performance and user experience. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to build your web page with React or something else in order to have a nice user experience. One example of that is DEV.TO. How many of you know this page? I assume quite many. Not many, okay. Well, it's a server-side rendered Ruby on Rails application, I guess. And then it feels still quite fast, and it's like nice to use. There's no you wouldn't almost even know that it's fully server-side rendered if you don't dig into it. But it's open source, so you can look at it if you want to. And then that was number 1, so performance. And then number 2 is, of course, search engine optimization. Google probably won't run your JavaScript, and even if it runs, there are rumors that it runs them JavaScript in with the 2 weeks delay, and it runs in Chrome 41, I guess, is the newest they are using. So imagine trying to make your JavaScript work well on Chrome 41. It's probably worse than IE. So in order to get good performance, you have to provide server-side rendered version of your site. And there are some solutions to this if you don't want to do server-side rendering, but I really don't know any reason why not. But if you don't want to, then you can do something like pre-rendering. So you can detect when the Google bot hits your server and then return the already rendered application for that. And there are services that do that for you. For example, if you're using Netlify, you can just do one tap, enable it, and then they will do the heavy lifting for you. But actually, I haven't tried that, so I can't really talk about it. But I've heard that Netlify is awesome. And number 3 reason is accessibility. So there are people who don't even use JavaScript on the web. And it would be nice to provide the content for them as well. And I think, at least when we had the visitors here at the accessibility event, it looked like the screen readers are actually waiting for the page to finish loading, and then they start reading the content. So that's why it would be quite important to get the content visible quickly and not delay the screen reader user experience. And also, performance is also about accessibility. So if you want to make your website accessible to everybody, remember the poor users who go home from work with a train from Helsinki. And between Helsinki and Pasila, there's practically no network at all. And number 4 reason is that not everything needs to be an app. So even though we quite often talk about web apps, we could basically replace app with web page. We are mostly building web pages and mostly static content. So quite often you don't need to build a client-side JavaScript application. And number 5 reason is archivability. So there may be projects or reasons why it would be nice to archive the whole project or every page. So that's super easy to do if you are already doing server-side rendering. Yeah, so now I have been talking a lot about why to do server-side rendering, and I mentioned I don't really know a reason why to, but why not to. But then there might be some cases. So for example, if your application would be a fully interactive web application, say a game. If you're building a game on the web, why would you even consider doing server-side rendering? Maybe just for the landing page, but then when you launch the actual game, it should be just client-side render. And interactivity. If it's super important for you that your users, or for your users that the application is interactive whenever it renders something, then maybe you can just do client-side rendering because it won't be interactive anyways before. One tip that I want to mention, don't render everything on the server, even though you would be doing server-side rendering. You can optimize the payload and optimize the experience by not rendering everything. So like we do currently, if you go to is.fi and look at the HTML that we return from the server, it's 5 meters of HTML content, so probably that's not the best idea. And it's not black and white. It's not like you have to actually choose just between client-side rendering and server-side rendering. You can combine the both and get the best of both worlds, maybe. So for example, there are libraries that do that for you. If you're using React, you can try out Next.js. It's a React framework that does the server-side rendering for you, and then when your client receives the bundle, then it hydrates the application for you, and you don't have to do that yourself. But of course, you can do that yourself as well. It's not that difficult. You just have the Node application running in the server as well, and you render. React has this React render to string, so you render your content to string, and then you provide the initial state to your client, and then in the client you initialize the app with the state that was returned by this server. Most importantly, remember to consider your users. Think about them when you choose the technology and the way you build your web application. And yeah, here are a couple of useful links to the material I was referring to, so you can check this out if you want, and I will share my slides later. And last, before I end, remember that we have this Futurice Dev Breakfast newsletter that you can subscribe to. So if you haven't yet, go to hello.futurice.com/devbreakfast. And yeah, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you for a great presentation. I was thinking about the delay that you have after receiving the initial HTML dump from the server and then basically getting the app to be interactive. Are there any recommended UX patterns, for example, for communicating that to the user so that you can kind of like show the UI and let the user orientate, but then like let them know that it's not quite ready yet? So would you like show a little spinner somewhere or something until the JavaScript actually takes over?
Well, I'm not sure about that specifically, but at least if you think about progressive web applications, then you can display some content that you have offline on the device, and then you can display that while the actual application is loading. So that's one option. You can have whatever content there offline. But other than that, I don't know.
Okay, thanks.